We're continuing our study of the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, 1953 to 1954. Today, we are finishing up our discussion of Chapter 21, Truth Emerges from the Mistake. And then we'll go on and wrap up our series with some remarks about the final chapter, Chapter 22, The Concept of Analysis. Lacan has made clear the meaning of the title of Chapter 21, again, which is Truth Emerges from the Mistake. According to Lacan, truth finds its way of getting into the world through slips of the tongue, moments of forgetfulness, recalled dreams, daydreams, jokes, and so on. Quite often the truth gets in when we suddenly speak and we don't say what we mean in the sense that it's what we intended to say. But in saying what we did, we nonetheless somehow got to what we deep down meant to say. Lacan says on page 267, quote, "Reality is defined by such contradiction. It is not clear why the unconscious should escape this type of contradiction, but when Freud talks about the suspension of the principle of non-contradiction in the unconscious, we find that it is in the unconscious that we uncover genuine speech. Not through observation, but through interpretation, in the symptom, in the dream, in the joke, and then we see the unconscious obeys laws other than those of discourse, which is subject to the condition of having to move within error up to the moment when it encounters contradiction. Authentic speech, on the other hand, has other modes, other means than everyday speech." End quote. Lacan goes on to say, also on page 266, that the, quote, "Freudian innovation is the revelation within the phenomenon of these subjective experience moments in which speech which goes beyond the discoursing subject emerges, an innovation that is so striking that it is only with difficulty that we can believe that it was never previously perceived." End quote. And another quote on page 268, he says, "Let us not forget that it made its presence felt in that portion of mankind which suffers, and it was quite clearly in the form of a morbid psychology, of a psychopathology, that the Freudian discovery was made." End quote. Freud was able to discover that it's in the aberrations from what constitutes ordinary mental health that we discover all those background unconscious processes that otherwise make a person tick. That's enough for chapter 21. Let's move on to the final chapter, chapter 22, the concept of analysis. And here we see Lacan summarizing what his work on transference has been so far, what he has been driving at. Lacan says on page 273, quote, "If I wanted to represent the three times of the structuration of speech in search of truth on the model of those allegorical paintings which proliferated in the Romantic era, like virtue pursuing crime aided by remorse, I would tell you," Lacan says, that his whole conception is error taking flight in deception and recaptured by mistake. Lacan says, "I hope you can see that that paints a picture of transference." End quote. Transference is the apotheosis of psychological resistance, and it is in the clinical setting that the analyst works with the patient to overcome this transference to arrive at the truth of the person, the patient, the subject. The patient has come to the analyst because he or she is suffering, or he has false notions about his or her suffering, and in the process of the therapy deceives even himself or herself about the nature of that suffering. And yet through the analytic process, like free association, dream works, slips of the tongue, and so on, the subject can make what he or she thinks is a mistake in speech, and at this juncture of a mistake, there can begin the opportunity for self-revelation. When these opportunities for self-revelation arise, the subject can choose to live in love or hate, or continue on in ignorance. But what we're all really after is love, according to Lacan. Lacan says on page 276 that love, quote, is essentially an attempt to capture the other in oneself as object, The desire to be loved is the desire that the loving object should be taken as such, caught up, enslaved to the absolute particularity of oneself as object. The person who aspires to be loved is not at all satisfied, as is well known, with being loved for his attributes. He demands to be loved as far as the complete subversion of the subject into particularity can go, and into whatever may be most opaque, most unthinkable in this particularity. One wants to be loved for everything, not only for one's ego, but for the color of one's hair, for one's idiosyncrasies, for one's weaknesses, for everything. But inversely, and I would say correlatively, as a result of exactly that, to love is to love a being beyond what he or she appears to be. The active gift of love is directed at the other, not in his specificity, but in his being. End quote. And to the extent that the subject comes to love, Lacan says, quote, he realizes himself symbolically in speech and homes in on the being of the other. This recognition of a deeper love is the truest path to a self-revelation, according to Lacan. Let's stop there. Thank you for taking this journey with me through Lacan's first seminar, and as always, thank you for listening.